I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It truly means a lot to me to see how far my voice reaches. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, a young lieutenant handed me her prenatal enrollment file, and on the second page, in the box marked father of the child, I read my husband's full name. Not a similar name, not a coincidence of common letters. His name, his date of birth, his phone number written in the careful round handwriting of a woman who clearly loved him. I was standing in my own hospital, wearing the rank of colonel, holding 23 years of military medicine in my hands, and the paper did not shake. That is the part people never believe. The paper did not shake. I looked up at the lieutenant, at her hopeful face, at the small curve already showing beneath her uniform, and I asked the question that would dismantle my entire life. Is the father excited? She smiled the way women smile when they are certain they are safe. He cries every time we hear the heartbeat, she said. We're getting married as soon as his divorce is final. His divorce. I had been married to that man for 16 years, and as far as I knew, no one had filed anything. I had spent my career preparing soldiers for wounds. I never imagined the deepest one I would ever treat would be my own, delivered across a desk by a woman who had no idea she was holding the knife. Carrington Army Medical Center sits on a low hill above the river, all glass and pale stone, the kind of building designed to convince people that order can hold back chaos. I took command of its outpatient directorate that March after 3 years running a field hospital program overseas. At 44 years old, with a caduceus on one collar and an eagle on the other, I believed I had already met every kind of emergency: hemorrhage, sepsis, mass casualty, grief. I knew the protocols for all of them. There is no protocol for what found me that spring. My name is Colonel Diane Brooks. My husband's name is Mark. We met when I was a captain, and he was a medical billing consultant attached to a contractor supporting my hospital in Germany. He was charming in the unhurried way of men who never have to deploy. He learned the rhythms of my career and made himself essential to them. When I worked 30-hour shifts, he left soup on the stove. When I missed holidays, he mailed photographs of the tree so I would not feel forgotten. People told me constantly how lucky I was. A husband who understands the uniform, they said. A man who waits. For 16 years, I believed I had married patience. I had actually married strategy. The first week at Carrington was administrative. Credentialing reviews, staffing briefs, a backlog of records audits that my predecessor had politely ignored. My office connected to a shared suite where the clinic's intake coordinators worked, and on my 4th morning, the chief nurse brought me a stack of new personnel and patient enrollment files that needed a commander's signature. Routine, ink, and paper. Among them was the file of First Lieutenant Megan Cole, a nurse newly assigned to my directorate, 27 years old, 11 weeks pregnant, requesting transfer of her prenatal care to our facility. She delivered the file herself. She knocked, stood at the doorway with the nervous formality of a junior officer meeting a new colonel, and apologized twice for the paperwork being out of order. I told her to sit. She had bright eyes and the kind of open face that makes patients trust nurses, and she talked while I flipped pages, the way nervous people do. She told me she had requested Carrington specifically because her fiancé lived nearby. She told me he worked in healthcare consulting, that he was older, that he had been through a difficult first marriage to someone who was never home. I turned the page and saw his name, Mark Anthony Brooks. Date of birth, the 4th of June. The phone number I had dialed from 3 continents, and one line below it, in the field reserved for insurance and sponsorship, a sponsor identification number that I recognized the way you recognize your own reflection, mine, my benefits, my federal record. The military health coverage I had earned through 23 years of service was listed as the payer for another woman's pregnancy, and the enrollment form claimed she was the sponsor's lawful spouse. There is a silence the body produces in catastrophe, a silence underneath the heartbeat. I sat inside it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then I uncapped my pen, signed the routine transfer line, and asked in a voice I borrowed from some calmer version of myself, "Is the father excited?" That was when she told me about the heartbeat and the tears and the divorce that was almost final. She said it with such tenderness that I felt the strangest grief, not only for myself but for her, because I understood immediately that she was not my enemy. She was the second story Mark was telling. I was simply the first. I asked how they met. "A conference," she said, 2 years ago, a healthcare compliance summit in Nashville. I remembered that summit. I had packed his suitcase for it. I had tucked his allergy medication into the side pocket and kissed him at the airport curb. She said he proposed on a beach in Florida last autumn. Last autumn, Mark had told me he was auditing a hospital network in Tampa. I had texted him a photograph of our anniversary dinner sitting on the table, untouched, with a joke about saving him the bigger steak. "Congratulations," I said. She glowed. "Thank you, ma'am. He's the most honest man I've ever known." When she left, I closed my office door, sat down behind my desk, and did not cry. I want to be truthful about that because people imagine collapse, and collapse would have been easier. What I felt instead was a cold clarity spreading through me like anesthesia, and underneath it, one professional thought rising with terrible precision. If my health benefits were paying for that pregnancy, then somewhere in a federal database, my husband had committed fraud against the United States government. This was no longer only a broken heart. This was a crime with my name on it. That evening, Mark called while I was driving home. His voice came through the car speakers, warm and familiar. "Hey, Colonel," he said, which had been his joke for 16 years. "How's the new empire?" I watched the road and answered in sentences I assembled like sutures. "Busy, understaffed, nothing I can't manage." He laughed softly. "They have no idea what just walked in the door," he said. "He told me he had a client dinner and would be home late. He told me not to wait up. He told me he loved me," and the sentence arrived with the smooth, frictionless ease of long practice. I said it back and noted with detached interest how easily the lie left my own mouth. That frightened me more than anything he had done. He was teaching me his language. Our house in the suburbs looked the same that night. His running shoes by the door, his coffee cup in the sink, a photograph from our wedding on the hallway shelf, the two of us laughing outside a small chapel, 26 and 31 years old, certain of everything. I changed out of my uniform with ceremonial slowness, hung the jacket, squared the boots, because small order is what you build when large order has failed. Then I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and logged into the benefits portal as the sponsor I had been since the day I raised my right hand. It took 11 minutes to find the first one, a claim for an obstetric consultation 8 weeks earlier, billed under my sponsorship, beneficiary listed as spouse, then an ultrasound, then laboratory panels, then scrolling backward through 3 years of records I had never once thought to examine, a history that rewrote my marriage line by line, dermatology visits in a city I had never lived in, a dental crown, an emergency room visit for a sprained wrist. 2 summers ago, on a weekend, Mark had told me he was fishing with his brother. The beneficiary on every claim was listed as Megan A. Brooks. He had not only deceived her, he had enrolled her. Somewhere, somehow, my husband had walked into a federal benefits office with documents claiming I no longer existed as his wife, and the system had believed him because the documents were good, because Mark's entire profession was knowing exactly how medical paperwork moves and where no one looks. I took screenshots. I exported statements. I opened a blank document and typed the date at the top, and underneath it, one word: timeline. I did not know yet what I was building. I only knew that buildings need foundations, and so does justice. Mark came home after midnight smelling of restaurant wine and someone else's evening. He undressed quietly, the careful quiet that guilty men mistake for kindness, and slid into bed beside me. "You awake?" he whispered. "Barely," I said. He kissed my shoulder. "Missed you," he said, and fell asleep within minutes, untroubled, while I lay in the dark beside a stranger wearing my husband's breathing. In the morning, he was cheerful. He made eggs. He asked about my staffing problems and offered advice, good advice, because he was genuinely brilliant at the machinery of medicine, which was precisely how he had learned to defraud it. As he talked, I watched his hands and thought about the consulting firm he had spent 2 years building, Brooks Meridian Health Partners, the company he said would finally let him stop traveling. The launch was 5 weeks away. He had told me about the investor presentations, the hospital network on the verge of signing, the contract that would, in his words, set us up for life. Us. I wondered which us he meant. That afternoon, I called Dana Whitfield from my car in the hospital parking garage. Dana had been an Army lawyer before she retired into private practice, and we had served together long enough ago that neither of us bothered with pleasantries. She answered on the second ring and listened to me lay it out the way I would brief a surgery: the file, the lieutenant, the claims, the enrollment, 3 years. When I finished, the line was silent for a moment, and then Dana said 5 words I will never forget. "Diane, this is bigger than divorce." She explained what I already suspected. Falsifying enrollment in the military health system is not a domestic dispute. It is fraud against the federal government. Forging or procuring false documents to do it compounds the crime. Every claim is a separate act. 3 years of claims is not an affair. It is a pattern of federal offenses committed using my identity, my service, and my name. And then Dana said the thing that changed the shape of everything. "You cannot sit on this. You're the commander of the facility now treating her. If this surfaces later and you knew, your career ends next to his. You have to report it, and you have to do it by the book, and you have to step out of the way." I closed my eyes. Part of me, I admit, had been dreaming in the language of revenge, a confrontation, a reckoning I would author personally. Dana took that away from me in a single sentence, and she was right to. "Document everything," she said. "Touch nothing you're not legally entitled to touch. Do not confront him. Do not warn her. Make your report, recuse yourself, and let the system you have served for 23 years do exactly what it was built to do." "What about the lieutenant?" I asked. "She doesn't know." Dana's voice softened by 1 degree. "Then the investigation will be the kindest thing that ever happens to her," she said. "Better the truth in a conference room than at an altar." That weekend, before anything official began, Mark suggested a drive to the coast. He held my hand across the console the entire way, the way he had when we were first married, and at a roadside stand he bought me peaches because he remembered I loved them, and for 2 unguarded minutes I almost grieved him in advance. That is the part of betrayal no one warns you about. The man who destroyed you does not vanish. He keeps showing up, charming and familiar, performing the marriage with such conviction that you begin to wonder whether your evidence dreamed itself. Standing in the salt wind, watching him laugh at a seagull stealing fries from a stranger's table, I understood why so many women fold, not from weakness, from the sheer gravitational pull of the life they already built. I ate the peach, I laughed at the seagull, and that night while he slept, I added the receipts from the trip to my timeline because Dana had taught me that even tenderness becomes a record, and a man who could forge a divorce decree could certainly forge a perfect Saturday. For 9 days after that, I lived 2 lives, which gave me a bitter new respect for how exhausting Mark's must have been. At home, I was a wife. I ate his dinners. I laughed at the correct moments. I listened to him rehearse his launch presentation in the living room, pacing, gesturing at an imaginary audience, saying words like integrity and transparency without a flicker of irony. At work, I was a commander assembling a report. I wrote down dates. I preserved records. I confirmed through nothing more than my own legal access that the sponsorship data was real and current. And on the 10th day, I drove to the regional office of the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, placed a folder on a steel table, and said, "I need to report benefits fraud, and I need you to know before I begin that the subject is my husband." The agent across the table was a quiet man named Reyes, with gray at his temples and the unhurried eyes of someone who had heard everything twice. He read for a long time. Then he looked up and asked, "Colonel, does he know that you know?" "No," I said. Reyes nodded slowly. "Keep it that way," he said. "Men like this run on confidence. Confidence makes them keep records." He turned a page. "One more question, ma'am, and I apologize for it. Is there any possibility the lieutenant knowingly participated?" I thought of her face, the open delight, the most honest man I've ever known. "There's always a possibility," I said, "but I would bet my pension she's a victim." Reyes made a note. "Then we'll treat her like one until the evidence says otherwise," he said, and something in my chest, some small overworked muscle, finally loosened. The investigation moved the way real things move, which is to say, invisibly. I recused myself from anything touching Lieutenant Cole's records and arranged, through ordinary channels, for her care team to be supervised by my deputy. At home, Mark grew busier and happier as his launch approached. He bought a new suit. He practiced his handshake, which I had not known was something men practiced. One evening, he came home with champagne and told me the hospital network had verbally committed $12 million over 4 years, he said, his eyes bright. He lifted his glass. "To the Brooks name," he said. I lifted mine. "To the Brooks name," I agreed, and I have never meant a toast more sincerely in my life, because by then I knew what investigators had found when they pulled the enrollment file. To make Megan a spouse in the eyes of the government, Mark had manufactured a divorce decree, a court document with a forged judge's signature dissolving his marriage to me. In the eyes of his second life, I was not betrayed. I was deleted. He had ended our marriage on paper years ago and simply never told the wife. I learned the rest in pieces, in a windowless room, in interviews where I answered questions with dates and account numbers and watched agents write. The consulting firm's startup capital traced back in part to our joint savings, moved in patient increments labeled as business development. The beach proposal in Florida was paid for on a card I had signed for. Even the engagement ring appeared in the records, $31,000, purchased the same month Mark had told me we should postpone replacing my 12-year-old car because money was tight. He was not living a double life. He was living one life, his, and billing it to 2 women who each believed they were his whole world. The launch of Brooks Meridian Health Partners took place on a Thursday evening in the glass atrium of a downtown hotel with a string quartet, a step and repeat banner, and 140 invited guests from the regional healthcare industry. I know the details because I was there. Agent Reyes had asked me, carefully, whether I wanted to be present, and Dana had asked me even more carefully whether I could be present without becoming the story. I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Then I put on a black dress and my wedding ring, not because I honored the marriage, but because Mark had spent 3 years pretending it did not exist, and I intended for it to be in the room. I arrived late and stood at the back near a marble column, holding a glass of water. Mark was magnificent. I will give him that forever. He stood under the lights in his new suit and spoke about trust as the foundation of health care, about how systems fail when good people look away, and the audience nodded, and somewhere near the front in a blue dress, visibly pregnant now, Megan Cole watched him with her whole heart in her face. She did not know I was there. She did not know anything yet. That was the last hour of her not knowing, and I felt the strange tenderness of a surgeon in the final moment before the first cut. He was 11 minutes into the presentation when the atrium doors opened. 4 people entered, 2 in suits, 2 in uniform, and the room did what rooms do, parting and quieting in a slow wave. Reyes walked the way he talked, without hurry. Mark saw them and kept speaking for 3 more sentences, and I watched comprehension arrive in his face in stages. Recognition, disbelief, calculation. The same sequence I had once watched on my own face in a powder room mirror, except that I had earned mine and he had built his. There was no shouting. Federal consequences rarely shout. Reyes spoke to him quietly at the edge of the stage. Papers were presented. The words I could not hear traveled through the crowd anyway, the way truth does, in whispers, in pulled-out phones, in the slow backward steps of investors recalculating risk. The hospital network's representatives left first. The quartet stopped playing mid-phrase, which somehow was the loudest sound of the night. Megan stood frozen near the front, both hands over her stomach, and I watched a young agent approach her gently and guide her toward a side room, and I knew that inside that room, the truth was going to be handed to her the way I had handed myself the timeline, one document at a time. I did not go to her. It was not my moment to take. But as she passed, her eyes crossed mine and paused, and I saw the question form, the impossible arithmetic, the colonel from the office, the new commander, the woman whose signature was on her transfer, and I gave her the only thing I could give her in public, a single small nod that meant, I know, and you didn't, and I know that too. Mark found me by the marble column as they walked him out. He stopped. The agents allowed it 4 seconds of it. He looked at my dress, at my ring, at my face, and he said my name the way a drowning man says the name of the shore. Diane. We can fix this. I studied him. This man whose soup I had eaten, whose suitcases I had packed, whose name I had carried into operating rooms on 3 continents. And I felt the strangest absence of hatred. Hatred would have meant he still had territory inside me. No, I said, you can answer for it. They walked him out under the banner with his own name on it, and the string quartet never finished the song. What came afterward took 14 months because real consequences are paperwork, not lightning. The forged divorce decree became the centerpiece of a federal indictment. The fraudulent claims, 311 of them, became counts. The firm dissolved before it ever invoiced a client. The actual divorce, my divorce, the real one, was almost anticlimactic by comparison. A quiet proceeding in which a judge looked at the evidence trail and awarded me the house, the restitution, and something the law has no word for but I do. My name back, clean. Lieutenant Cole was cleared of all knowledge within weeks, exactly as I had bet. She transferred to another facility before the baby came, and on her last day at Carrington, she asked to see me. She stood in my doorway the way she had that first morning, except that everything in her face had aged a year in a season. She did not apologize because Dana was right. She had nothing to apologize for, but she said, "Ma'am, I keep thinking I should have seen it." I came around the desk. "Lieutenant," I said, "I lived with him for 16 years and signed the paperwork that exposed him by accident. We do not see what we are not looking for. That is not a flaw. That is what trust is." She sent me a photograph that winter, a newborn in a yellow blanket, and one line: "She will know the truth her whole life." I wrote back 2 words: "So will mine." People ask me, the few who know the whole story, whether I feel victorious. I never know how to answer. Victory sounds like something that happens to an opponent, and the truth is that Mark was never really my opponent. He was my blind spot, and the work of those 14 months was not defeating him. It was recovering my own eyes. On my last morning before transferring to a new command, I walked the hospital corridors early, before the shift change, past the clinic where a routine file had once been placed in my hands. The building was waking up, monitors chirping, coffee brewing, young medics laughing at something down the hall, order holding back chaos the way it was designed to. Here is what I hope you carry out of my story. Betrayal will try to convince you that your judgment is broken, that because you missed one truth, you can no longer be trusted with any of them. Do not believe it. The same discipline that made you miss the signs, the loyalty, the steadiness, the refusal to assume the worst of someone you love, is the discipline that will carry you through the proving of it. You do not have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the most devastating thing a woman can do is open a folder, state the facts, and let the truth wear the uniform. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and tell me honestly, would you have made it through that first meeting without the paper shaking? If you believe that quiet strength outlasts every lie, subscribe and stay with us. There are more stories ahead, and every one of them is proof that dignity can survive even the deepest betrayal.